My heart was still pounding when I closed the bedroom door behind me, the laundry basket slipping from my hands onto the floor. I pressed my back against the wall, eyes shut tight, trying to erase what I had just seen. But the harder I tried, the clearer the image became. The sound of water running. The steam curling into the hallway. The hum of his voice, light and carefree, like he didn't have a single worry in the world. And then the floorboard. That cursed, creaky floorboard. I hadn't meant to look. God, I hadn't meant to. But the bathroom door had been left ajar, and for a split second, my curiosity got the better of me. It was an innocent glance, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. But now, as I stood there trying to steady my breath, guilt coiled tightly around my chest. What was wrong with me? I replayed the moment in my head, over and over. I'd been carrying laundry upstairs, caught up in my usual routine. The door hadn't fully closed, and steam had spilled into the hallway like a whisper, drawing my attention. I should have turned away right then and there. Instead, I hesitated. The faint sound of humming reached my ears, a tune so off-key it almost made me smile. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect from a 21-year-old man, and that was probably why I leaned in, just slightly. The gap in the door was narrow, but enough. He was standing there, under the shower spray, completely unaware. His movements were unhurried, his humming soft and rhythmic. It wasn't the sight of him that unsettled me, it was the moment itself. The intimacy of it. The realization that I was standing there, watching. I stepped back, my foot landing squarely on the hallway's weakest plank. The sound tore through the air like a firecracker, and his humming stopped abruptly. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, praying he hadn't heard me. Hello? His voice carried a cautious edge, but I didn't stay long enough to hear more. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me down the hallway and into my room. Now, I stared at the basket of laundry on the floor, my hands trembling. It was nothing. Just a glance. An accident. And yet, the knot in my stomach told me it wasn't that simple. I felt exposed, like I'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. The next morning, I tiptoed downstairs, hoping to avoid him altogether. But there he was, sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling on his phone and munching on toast. He looked completely unbothered, as though nothing had happened. Maybe it really was nothing. Maybe I was the only one who couldn't let it go. I busied myself with pouring coffee, my hands unsteady as I tried to act normal. The silence between us was deafening. Every sound, his chewing, the clink of my spoon against the cup, felt amplified. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, afraid of what I might see in his expression. I sat across from him, forcing myself to eat. Out of the corner of my eye, I could feel his gaze flicker toward me, just for a moment. My stomach tightened. Did he know? Did he suspect anything? I was probably imagining it, but the weight of his glance felt heavier than usual. The day passed in a haze. I cleaned, ran errands, and tried to shake the memory of what had happened. But it clung to me, stubborn and unrelenting. Every time I walked past the bathroom door, I felt a flicker of shame. The house, usually a place of comfort, now felt foreign, as though the walls themselves were holding a secret. By the evening, I was drained, not from activity, but from the effort of keeping myself together. I retreated to my room early, grateful for the solitude. But as I sat there, staring out the window, the unease crept back in. It wasn't just the moment in the hallway that haunted me. It was the shift that came with it. Something had changed. I didn't know what it was or how to fix it. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. The days after that moment felt like walking on eggshells. On the surface, everything seemed normal. He went about his routine, his late morning wake-ups, long showers, and afternoons spent at the kitchen table with his laptop open, headphones on. But beneath that facade was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into chores that didn't need doing. I cleaned the windows, scrubbed the grout in the bathroom, and reorganized the pantry twice. Anything to keep my hands moving and my mind from wandering. But no matter how much I busied myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken hung between us. One afternoon, I caught him in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water. The late sun cast golden light through the window, making the room feel warmer than it should have. He glanced at me briefly before turning back to the sink. His movements were casual, but I noticed how his shoulders tensed ever so slightly. "Do you need help with anything today?" he asked, his tone neutral. The question caught me off guard. He never offered to help, not because he was unwilling, but because we'd always had an unspoken understanding. I handled the house, and he kept to himself. This offer, small as it was, felt significant. "No, I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice tighter than I intended. "But thank you." He nodded, taking a sip of water before retreating to his room. As he disappeared up the stairs, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The simple exchange felt loaded, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Was it guilt? Suspicion? Or something else entirely? Later that evening, I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap, though I couldn't focus on the words. The quiet hum of the television drifted in from the kitchen where he was watching something, the sound just loud enough to remind me of his presence. I told myself I needed to relax, to stop reading into every glance, every word, every moment. But how could I, when the atmosphere between us felt so charged? When he finally passed through the living room to head upstairs, I kept my eyes glued to the book, pretending not to notice. But I did notice, the way his footsteps slowed as he walked by, the way his gaze lingered for just a moment too long. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, though I couldn't explain why. That night, I lay awake long after the house had gone still. The events of the past week played on a loop in my mind, each memory more vivid than the last. What struck me most wasn't the embarrassment or even the guilt. It was the shift in his demeanor, subtle but undeniable. He was watching me differently now, and whether it was real or imagined, I couldn't escape the weight of it. I told myself it would pass, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew better. Moments like these, fraught with unspoken words and quiet tension, had a way of snowballing. They started small, but they never stayed that way. The tension was becoming unbearable, like a heavy fog that clung to every corner of the house. I couldn't escape it, no matter how much I tried to distract myself. Each glance, each word exchanged, seemed to carry a weight it hadn't before. And yet, nothing had been said. Nothing had been acknowledged. It was a quiet Saturday morning when everything came to a head. The house was still as I folded a fresh load of laundry in the living room, sunlight streaming through the curtains. He came downstairs, his hair still damp from a shower, and paused in the doorway. "Do you need help with that?" His voice was casual, but something about it made me look up. "No, I've got it," I replied, though the pile of clothes in front of me told a different story. He hesitated, then stepped into the room anyway, sitting down on the opposite side of the coffee table. Without asking, he grabbed one of the folded towels and began refolding it, his movements deliberate. I watched him for a moment, unsure of what to say, until the silence between us became too loud to ignore. "You don't have to do that," I said softly, my voice faltering. "I know," he replied, not looking up. Something about his tone made my chest tighten. It wasn't defiant, but it wasn't casual either. It was weighted, like there was something he wasn't saying. I turned back to the laundry, trying to focus on the task at hand. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Things have been weird lately." I froze, my hand stilling over a shirt I'd been folding. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. He continued, his gaze fixed on the towel in his hands. "I feel like there's this distance between us now. Like we're avoiding something." My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine, and I felt the breath leave my lungs. There was something raw in his expression, something I wasn't prepared to face. "You know what I mean," he said softly. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unrelenting, until he stood and walked around the table to stand in front of me. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding in my ears as he leaned down slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, before I could process what was happening, he leaned closer and pressed his lips to mine. It was quick, barely lasting a second, but it was enough to leave me breathless. I pulled back immediately, my hand coming up to cover my mouth as I stared at him in shock. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He stepped back, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I stood up abruptly, the laundry forgotten as I backed away from him. My heart was racing, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of confusion and disbelief. "This can't happen," I said, more to myself than to him. This isn't right." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know. I'm sorry." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there alone. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, my mind racing. I closed the door behind me and sank onto the edge of the bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The moment replayed in my mind, over and over, until I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. What had just happened? How had things spiraled so far out of control? And, most terrifying of all, why did a part of me not regret it? The following days were a blur of awkward exchanges and unspoken words. I avoided him as much as I could, keeping myself busy with errands, housework, anything that gave me a reason to stay out of the house or behind a closed door. But avoidance was a flimsy shield. The memory of that moment, his lips brushing mine, lingered like a bruise that refused to fade. He seemed to sense the shift, though he didn't try to confront me. Instead, his presence became more subdued, almost cautious. He'd enter a room, glance at me as if gauging my mood, and then retreat. There were no more casual offers to help, no more lingering looks. It should have been a relief, but instead, it only heightened the tension between us. One afternoon, I decided to clean the garage, thinking the physical labor might clear my head. The space was cluttered with boxes of old holiday decorations, tools, and forgotten knickknacks. I threw myself into the task, wiping dust off surfaces and organizing the chaos into neat piles. The rhythmic motion of sorting and stacking was comforting, giving me a sense of control I desperately needed. I was halfway through rearranging a stack of boxes when I heard the garage door creak open behind me. My stomach tightened as I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, the weight of the past few days pressing down on me. I wanted to say no, to send him back inside where the invisible wall between us could remain intact. But the look on his face stopped me. There was no defiance, no challenge, just quiet sincerity. "Sure," I said finally, stepping aside to let him in. He moved carefully, like he didn't want to disturb the delicate balance we'd fallen into. Together, we worked in silence, stacking boxes, and sweeping the dusty floor. The air between us felt heavy, filled with things neither of us dared to say. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same box, and I pulled away quickly, my pulse quickening. He didn't react, but I caught the way his jaw tightened. When the garage was finally organized, I leaned against the workbench, wiping sweat from my forehead. He stood a few feet away, his eyes on the floor. The silence stretched on, growing more suffocating by the second. "About the other day," he said suddenly, his voice breaking through the quiet. My heart lurched, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We don't need to talk about it," I said quickly, cutting him off. "But I think we do," he replied, his tone steady but soft. "I messed up. I don't know what came over me." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "It was a mistake," I said firmly. "And it can't happen again." "I know," he said, his gaze finally meeting mine. There was something raw in his eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I just don't want things to stay like this. I hate how awkward it's been." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. "We'll figure it out," I said, more to convince myself than him. "But for now, let's just focus on moving forward." He gave a small nod and stepped back, putting more distance between us. Without another word, he left the garage, leaving me alone in the quiet. I leaned against the workbench, my breath shaky, as the weight of the conversation settled over me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the words replaying in my mind. He hated the awkwardness, but what about me? I wasn't sure I could ever forget what had happened, no matter how much I tried. And the worst part? A small, selfish part of me didn't want to. I turned onto my side, closing my eyes tightly. It didn't matter what I wanted. This couldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. But as much as I told myself that, I couldn't stop the doubt creeping into the edges of my mind. The next few days felt like an uneasy truce. We operated in a careful rhythm, avoiding each other just enough to keep the tension from boiling over, but not enough to erase its presence entirely. I busied myself with anything that could occupy my mind, yet every quiet moment dragged me back to that forbidden thought, that fleeting moment I should have stopped but didn't. My husband was finally home after days away for work. I hoped his presence would reset the energy in the house, grounding everything back into normalcy. He'd arrived late the previous night, exhausted and barely awake. This morning, as I prepared breakfast, I was determined to make everything feel as it should be, a family, together, and unshaken. He came downstairs, giving me his usual warm smile as he sat at the table. I placed his coffee in front of him, and he reached for my hand, giving it a small squeeze. It was a simple gesture, but it reminded me of how far I'd let my mind wander in the past week. Here he was, steady, loving, familiar. This was my life, my foundation, and I needed to hold on to it. We sat down to eat, and for the first time in days, I felt a faint sense of calm. I kept the conversation light, asking about his trip, filling him in on the mundane happenings at home. He listened attentively, nodding and smiling in all the right places. But every now and then, his gaze would linger, his brow furrowing slightly, as if sensing something just below the surface. By mid-morning, he suggested we spend some time together, just the two of us. I agreed, though I felt a small pang of guilt for how much effort it took to feign enthusiasm. We decided to take a walk through the nearby park, a quiet, familiar space where we'd shared countless memories over the years. The air was crisp, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot filled the silence between us. He took my hand as we strolled, his touch warm and reassuring. It was exactly what I needed, a reminder of the life we'd built together. And yet, my mind betrayed me, flashing back to the brush of someone else's hand, the weight of a glance that lingered too long. We stopped by the small pond in the center of the park, the water rippling gently in the breeze. He turned to me, his expression soft but searching. "You've been quiet," he said. "Is everything okay?" I nodded quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Just tired, that's all." He didn't press further, but his silence carried a weight I couldn't ignore. As we stood there, I felt his hand slide to my lower back, a familiar gesture of closeness. I turned to him, forcing myself to focus on the moment, on him. When he leaned in to kiss me, I didn't hesitate. His lips were warm, steady, and comforting, yet I couldn't shake the hollowness that settled in my chest. This was what I wanted, what I needed. But it felt like I was holding on to something fragile, something that could shatter with the slightest push. The kiss ended, and he smiled at me, his thumb brushing my cheek. I smiled back, but my stomach churned. He deserved so much better than the half-hearted affection I was giving him, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap between who I was and who I wanted to be in his eyes. That evening, the three of us sat down for dinner. My husband was cheerful, recounting stories from his trip, while I focused on keeping my expression neutral. Across the table, I caught a glimpse of my stepson. He was quiet, his gaze flitting between me and my husband with an unreadable expression. My chest tightened, and I quickly looked away. As the meal went on, I felt his presence like a shadow, his silence heavier than any words he could have spoken. My husband didn't seem to notice, too caught up in his stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting again, another crack forming in the delicate balance I'd been trying so hard to maintain. That night, I lay awake next to my husband, his soft snores filling the room. My thoughts churned, restless and unrelenting. The kiss in the park, the quiet tension at dinner, the weight of every unsaid word, it all pressed down on me like a storm cloud, suffocating and inescapable. I told myself I could fix this, that I could hold it all together. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The house felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were bearing the weight of everything unspoken. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, but even its warmth couldn't pierce the tension that seemed to follow me everywhere. I busied myself with small tasks, wiping the counters, organizing the pantry. It didn't matter that I'd done the same yesterday. Anything to keep my hands moving and my mind quiet. Footsteps creaked on the stairs. I didn't have to look up to know it was him. His presence filled the space even before he stepped into the kitchen. He moved deliberately, as though each step carried a thought he wasn't ready to share. I kept my eyes on the tea I was stirring, willing myself to stay composed. The sound of the fridge door opening, the clink of a glass against the counter, it all felt amplified in the suffocating silence. He lingered, as he often did now, standing close enough for me to feel the weight of his gaze. I tried to ignore it, but my chest tightened with every passing second. His movements were measured, deliberate, as though he was testing the air between us, waiting for a crack. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with an already spotless countertop. The tension pressed down harder, and I could feel his frustration even without a word exchanged. Eventually, he left the room, and the air felt marginally lighter, though the knot in my stomach remained. Later that afternoon, I decided to tackle the attic. The cluttered space had been begging for attention, and I convinced myself that clearing it out might clear my mind as well. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old cardboard. I dove into the work, pulling boxes from corners that hadn't been touched in years, sorting through forgotten trinkets and memories. I was lost in the rhythm of organizing when I heard the attic stairs creak behind me. The sound froze me in place. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. His presence filled the room in the same way it had the kitchen earlier, unspoken but undeniable. Without a word, he moved closer, crouching beside me as I handed him a box. He took it without hesitation, and we fell into an uneasy rhythm, sorting and stacking in silence. The attic felt smaller with him there, the walls pressing in. Our hands brushed once as we reached for the same item, and I recoiled instinctively. The silence was unbearable, thick with questions neither of us dared to ask. I focused on the task, but my thoughts churned relentlessly. Every glance, every movement felt charged, like the air before a storm. When the work was finally done, I stood, brushing dust from my jeans. He remained crouched for a moment longer before rising, his gaze lingering on me. I avoided looking at him, afraid of what I might see, or what he might see in me. I descended the stairs quickly, leaving him behind. By the time I reached the bottom, my heart was racing, my breath shallow. The weight of his presence still hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, waiting to break free. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I moved through the house mechanically, avoiding places where I might run into him. But no matter how much distance I tried to create, the tension followed me, a constant reminder that the fragile balance I was clinging to wouldn't hold for long. The days passed in an unbearable haze, a routine coated in silence. The house felt smaller now, every corner charged with tension that refused to dissipate. Each step, each glance carried weight, though neither of us dared to confront it. My husband came and went, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. His presence, while comforting, only magnified the contrast between the life I was trying to maintain and the one I was on the verge of unraveling. By the weekend, the pressure had grown unbearable. I told myself I needed to reclaim control, to restore the normalcy I'd so carefully built over the years. The weather had turned warm, so I suggested we all spend time outside. My husband agreed without hesitation, and even he, though reluctant at first, eventually nodded. We ended up in the backyard, a small patch of green bordered by the familiar wooden fence that had stood for years. My husband busied himself with grilling, chatting about mundane things, work, neighbors, the latest news. I tried to respond, keeping my tone light, though my chest felt tight. He sat off to the side, silent and watchful, his presence unmistakable even when he wasn't speaking. I avoided looking at him, focusing instead on the sound of the wind rustling through the trees or the sizzle of meat on the grill. But it didn't matter. I could feel him, the way his attention lingered on me like a weight I couldn't shrug off. At one point, my husband went inside to grab more drinks. The moment the sliding door closed behind him, the air shifted. The silence between us grew louder, pressing in on me like the walls of a collapsing room. I kept my gaze on the horizon, pretending not to notice the way he moved closer, his footsteps soft against the grass. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, carrying an edge of frustration. "You can't keep pretending nothing happened." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I didn't flinch. My hands tightened around the edge of the chair, my knuckles white. "There's nothing to talk about," I said evenly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking. I could feel his presence like a shadow, heavy and unrelenting. "You don't believe that," he said, his tone almost accusing. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the patio. The motion startled him, and for a moment, we stood there in a standoff, the tension between us crackling like static electricity. "You need to let this go," I said finally, my voice low but firm. "It's over." He didn't move, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might argue, might push the issue further. But then he stepped back, his shoulders stiff, and turned away. When my husband returned, drinks in hand and a cheerful smile on his face, the mood had shifted again. I plastered on a smile, forcing myself to engage, to laugh at his jokes and nod in agreement when he spoke. But the weight of what had just happened hung over me like a storm cloud, dark and unyielding. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I stared at the ceiling, my mind churning. The conversation replayed in my head on an endless loop, each word sinking deeper into my chest. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that putting distance between us was the only way to fix this. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. The truth was undeniable. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The evening was deceptively calm. The kind of stillness that settles before a storm, lulling you into a false sense of security. My husband had gone to bed early, tired from the long week, leaving the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I told myself this was what I needed: a peace, time to collect my thoughts, and space to reset everything that had spiraled so far out of control. But the quiet was a trap. It gave my thoughts too much room to wander, my defenses too much slack. As I sat in the living room, the faint glow of the lamp casting soft shadows on the walls, I couldn't ignore the tension that had been simmering all day. It wasn't just the usual unease. Tonight, it felt heavier, closer, like a door waiting to be opened. I heard the sound of footsteps descending the stairs and immediately tensed. He appeared in the doorway, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable. He lingered there for a moment, his presence filling the space as effortlessly as it always did. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as though he was testing the waters. I nodded, unsure of what to say. My instinct was to tell him to go back to bed, to keep the distance between us intact. But my words caught in my throat, and before I could summon the strength to speak, he stepped further into the room. He moved to the couch, sitting down at the far end. The space between us felt like both too much and not enough. I could feel his gaze on me, though I refused to look at him. Instead, I focused on the book in my lap, the words blurring together as my pulse quickened. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Every breath, every shift in position felt amplified, like the house itself was holding its breath. I wanted to stand, to leave the room and escape this unbearable tension, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. "You're avoiding me," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands gripped the edges of the book tightly, the pages bending under the pressure. "I don't blame you," he continued, his tone softer now, almost resigned. "But pretending it didn't happen doesn't make it go away." I looked up then, meeting his eyes for the first time that evening. There was something raw in his expression, a vulnerability that caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words refused to come. He stood abruptly, closing the distance between us in a single step. My heart raced as he crouched slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the couch. For a moment, he just looked at me, his gaze searching, waiting for something I couldn't give. And then it happened. It was sudden, a blur of motion and heat. His lips were on mine before I could process what was happening, the weight of his presence overwhelming. My breath hitched, my body frozen in place. The kiss was desperate, insistent, as though it was trying to convey everything words couldn't. For a second, just a second, I let myself sink into it, the chaos of the past weeks melting away. But reality came crashing back with brutal clarity. I pulled away sharply, my hands coming up to push him back. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. His expression faltered, the rawness in his eyes replaced by something darker, regret, maybe, or realization. He stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, and backed away toward the doorway. My mind was racing, a chaotic swirl of emotions I couldn't untangle. "This can't happen," I said, more to myself than to him. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know." I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, my hands were shaking, my chest tight with a mix of fear and something I couldn't name. When I reached the bedroom, my husband was still asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at him, and felt a wave of guilt so strong it nearly knocked me over. I slid into bed carefully, trying not to wake him, and stared at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning out of control. This wasn't just a mistake. It was something bigger, something that threatened to tear apart everything I'd built. And no matter how much I wanted to believe I could fix it, deep down, I knew the damage was already done. The morning felt unreal. It was the same routine as every other day, except it wasn't. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the quiet chaos that had unfolded the night before. I moved through the motions like a ghost, the weight of what had happened last night pressing down on me with every step. My husband was still asleep when I woke up, his steady breathing the only sound filling the room. For a moment, I stayed still, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to gather the strength to face the day. I had to push through. I told myself it was just a momentary lapse, that things would return to normal once the dust settled. But I knew deep down that I was lying to myself. That kiss, that moment, it had shattered something, and nothing would ever be the same again. I slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to disturb my husband, who remained oblivious to the storm that had been unleashed. I dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I buttoned my shirt. I didn't know how to look at him, how to act like everything was fine when it was anything but. The kitchen was empty when I entered, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet space. I grabbed a mug from the cabinet, filling it with coffee without really thinking. The warmth of the cup should have been comforting, but it only served to heighten the tension coiling in my stomach. As I sat down at the table, my mind replayed everything. The kiss. The look in his eyes. The way it felt to pull away from him, to feel the weight of guilt wash over me. It had been a mistake, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. I forced myself to drink the coffee, trying to steady my hands. My thoughts were a jumble, fragments of emotions I couldn't sort through. The guilt, the fear, the lingering sense of longing. I didn't know what any of it meant, only that it was too heavy to ignore. Just as I set the cup down, I heard footsteps behind me. He appeared in the doorway, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before he stepped inside. His presence seemed to fill the room, and I couldn't help but tense, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between us. "Morning," he said, his voice low and steady. I nodded but didn't respond, my throat too tight to speak. The silence between us stretched on, thick and suffocating. I couldn't meet his gaze, afraid of what I might see in his eyes. He stood there for a moment, his posture tense, like he was waiting for me to say something, anything. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up my coffee again, forcing myself to focus on the task of drinking it, as if the simple action could shield me from the reality I was too afraid to face. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed and turned toward the door. I didn't watch him leave. I couldn't. The weight of his absence was almost as unbearable as the quiet that had fallen between us. I finished the coffee in silence, then began clearing the table. The movements were mechanical, a way to distract myself from the gnawing sense of dread that was steadily growing. I told myself I was overreacting, that it wasn't as big a deal as it felt. But deep down, I knew. I knew something had changed, and there was no going back from it. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the living room, pacing back and forth. I couldn't sit still, couldn't concentrate on anything. The house felt like a prison, the walls closing in with every passing minute. I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss, about the way things had escalated so quickly, about the way he had looked at me afterward, like he was waiting for me to make sense of it, to give him the answers we both needed. But I didn't have the answers. I didn't even know where to begin. When my husband came home later, his usual cheerful demeanor did little to break the suffocating atmosphere between us. He was tired, preoccupied with work, but there was an underlying tension in his voice when he spoke to me. He knew something was off, but I didn't know how to explain it without shattering everything. By the time dinner arrived, the quiet had settled in again. We ate, spoke of inconsequential things, but the distance between us felt insurmountable. Every word, every glance, every pause was pregnant with unspoken questions. I couldn't bring myself to look at him for too long, afraid that if I did, the truth would spill out. After dinner, I retreated to the bedroom, my heart heavy with the weight of the day. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet my racing thoughts. But they refused to be silenced. I knew the truth. I knew that the fragile fabric of my life had already begun to unravel. And I had no idea how to stop it. The evening sky was streaked with muted shades of orange and gray as I sat alone in the living room. The weight of the past weeks pressed down on me, the silence in the house almost deafening. My husband was still at work, and the solitude felt heavier than ever. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to give. I stared at the photos on the mantel, snapshots of moments that felt like they belonged to a different life. The smiling faces, the carefree laughter frozen in time, felt like a cruel reminder of what I had undone. But regret wasn't enough to change anything now. The choices had been made. The cracks had spread too far. The sound of the door opening snapped me out of my thoughts. He walked in, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a mask of quiet determination. I didn't say anything as he approached, my heart pounding in my chest. The air between us felt electric, charged with unspoken words and emotions too heavy to name. He stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on me. And then, in a voice that was steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place, he said, "I think we need to talk." I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. He sat across from me, the table between us feeling like both a barrier and a bridge. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, he spoke. "This can't go on," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's not fair to either of us." I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the couch. I knew he was right, but the truth still cut deep. "I know," I said softly, the words barely audible. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "I'm leaving," he said. "I've already packed my things." The room spun around me, the weight of his words hitting me like a physical blow. I wanted to speak, to ask him to stay, but I knew it would be selfish. This was the only way forward, the only way to end the cycle we'd trapped ourselves in. As he stood and walked toward the door, I felt a surge of emotion rise in my chest. Before I could stop myself, I called out, "Wait." He turned, his hand on the doorknob, and for a moment, our eyes met. The air between us was heavy with everything we'd left unsaid. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I wished things had been different. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I forced a smile, my voice trembling as I said, "Take care of yourself." He nodded, his expression softening for just a moment. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there for what felt like hours, the silence in the house pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't bear. But as the minutes passed, a strange sense of clarity began to settle over me. It wasn't peace, exactly, but something close to it. A quiet acceptance of the choices I'd made and the consequences they'd brought. The house was still, the shadows growing longer as night fell. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale, the weight on my chest lifting ever so slightly. The cracks in my life were still there, but they no longer felt like the end of the world. They were a reminder, a painful, necessary reminder, that sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go.